My name is Liam Clear. I'm the current branch chairman of the Republic of Ireland branch of CIWEM, who are sponsoring this paper along with the Water and Environment section of Engineers Ireland, represented by Diarmuid Cahalane, who's with us this evening as well. The title of this evening's paper is SUDS, How Do We Respond to a Change in Emphasis? And the paper is being presented by Diarmuid Cahalane of TJ O'Connor and Associates. Diarmuid is a graduate of civil engineering from UCC. He also has a Master of Engineering Science. As it happens, he's a colleague of mine for more than 15 years. And for as long as I've known him, he's had a particular interest in this area, and he has a lot of real-life working experience to rely on in terms of the lecture he's going to deliver this evening. In terms of the format of the presentation, it's expected to last for around 30-35 minutes, and that will be followed by a question and answer session. So with that, it's over to you, Diarmuid.
Thank you, Liam, and I'd like to thank the Republic of Ireland branch of CIWEM and the Water and Environmental section of Engineers Ireland for giving me the opportunity to give this talk this evening. It's my intention to, I suppose, take a quick run through the development of SUDS and a review of their use in Ireland and international policy for their implementation. And I also propose to look at some of the more what I would consider to be the more underused SUDS, and I suppose ask the question why we tend to ignore particular SUDS techniques. I also intend to touch upon the retrofitting of SUDS. SUDS to date have been used more extensively for new development, and they could present a great opportunity in terms of both water quality improvement and flood risk management in relation to existing development. So I hope you'll find the topic interesting, and that it'll raise a few questions at the end, which is my intention. I suppose I would like to question why there isn't a clear and coherent policy in respect of SUDS, or clear guidance on a national basis in Ireland at present. Last year, I think it was last October, in CIWEM's Environment magazine, one of the contributors, Tim Evans, wrote about missed opportunities for stormwater management, and he described a plane tree outside the headquarters of the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, in Smith Square in central London. And he commented that the tree was situated on a pavement with a gully alongside, separated by the curb. Rainwater went to the gully and the tree was ignored. He just commented on the irony that outside the government agency responsible for drainage policy in the UK, there was a tree that could be the hub of a retrofitted rain garden, and instead the runoff goes straight into a combined sewer. Last year as well, Dublin City Council announced the publication of a public realm plan for the Grafton Street quarter in the centre of Dublin. The announcement was accompanied by a fact sheet which included an image of a recently completed public realm scheme in central Dublin. I think it's either Clarendon Street or Fade Street, and the photograph is complete with, or the scheme was complete with newly planted trees in planters. Tim Evans' comments could have been transferred directly across the Irish Sea, although in fairness to Dublin City Council, in response to observations on that draft Grafton Street Quarter public realm plan, the council did state that the temporary nature of the scheme required the use of planters rather than in-ground planting. Still, it looks like a missed opportunity to me. Contrast that with the headquarters of the US EPA. Tim Evans, in his article in the Environment magazine, commented that Americans are better at providing interpretive information, but they're also possibly better at giving leadership. This was brought home to me last May when I was in Washington, DC. The US EPA's headquarters are only 200 yards from the White House on Constitution Avenue, facing the Mall. The grass beside or between the sidewalk and the headquarters of the EPA is maybe 3 meters wide, but it's a densely planted rain garden, complete with signboards communicating the benefits of rain garden and explaining the water cycle and surface water, stormwater management to the thousands of government officials and passers-by who pass daily. The difference in the approaches is stark. Urban drainage management, and in particular green infrastructure, or low impact development as it is known in the United States, is right at the centre of government in Washington. Contrast that with our own Dáil and the surface car park in front of Leinster House on Kildare Street. I designed my first attenuation pond almost 30 years ago for the UK terminal of the Channel Tunnel at Cheriton in Folkestone. The term sustainable urban drainage, or the acronym SUDS, had not been coined at the time, but there was a realisation that storm or sewer networks had a finite capacity for surface water conveyance. Attenuation was an engineering solution that allowed development occur in locations where the sewer network or streams had limited capacity to accommodate additional flows. The attenuation pond at Cheriton occupied an area of less than a hectare on a 300 hectare site or 300 acre site, and it was an engineered area. There was no attempt to landscape it. It was purely functional. Fast forward 15 years to the 1999-2000. I was involved in the development of the Waterville estate on the grounds, on former grounds of James Connolly Hospital in Blanchardstown. 1,560 residential units were constructed on that site, or the majority of them have been constructed at this stage. The surface water drainage system for that development comprised conventional piped system discharging to a 6,000 square metre pond, which became the centre point or the focal point of a regional park that was handed over to Fingal County Council. But it's an end-of-line solution. There was no other SUDS component in that scheme. Too often, I intend to, as I stated already, to pose some questions and try and tease out how we should be implementing SUDS now, 15 years on from that particular scheme in Waterville, and when the emphasis is shifting, and why is it the case that the government or state agency policy in respect of SUDS is fragmented or non-existent? Too often we pay lip service to aspirations but do not provide incentives to provide properly designed schemes, or we don't impose penalties for failing to implement such schemes. Local authorities refer to policy objectives in their county development plans, but too often these are vague or ambiguous or easily circumvented. There is little incentive for developers to fully embrace sustainable drainage or green infrastructure in full. This is evident in the UK also, where in recent weeks the Environment Secretary Eric Pickles has directed that SUDS must be provided for new developments of 10 houses or more, but only if the SUD scheme is no more expensive than conventional drainage. Couched in these terms, the message is that SUDS must be the more expensive option. However, in reality, it does not have to be. What are SUDS? I suppose SUDS have evolved since the 1980s, and considerably so in the last decade. In essence, SUDS mimic natural drainage patterns by storing runoff and releasing it slowly, attenuation, by allowing water infiltrate the ground, infiltration, filtering out pollutant, filtration, allowing sediments to settle out by controlling the flow of water, and more recently by creating attractive environments for people and for wildlife. Originally, the emphasis was on attenuation only, and solutions were engineered and more often than not below ground. This gave rise to issues with regard to accessibility for maintenance and lack of certainty regarding availability of storage volumes when they were needed most. Over time, SUDS have evolved to include water quality and further expanded to consider amenity and biodiversity benefits, and also water resources benefits, community benefits and recreational benefits. The emphasis has moved on from below ground end-of-line SUDS to above ground and at source SUDS. As I said, sustainable urban drainage systems are intended to minimise the impacts of development on the quantity and quality of runoff and maximise amenity and biodiversity opportunities of the area. The philosophy of this system is to replicate as closely as possible the natural drainage from lands prior to development, thereby minimising the impact of the development on water quality in the receiving waters and the quantity of runoff in the area. SUDS should be designed to treat runoff and return it to the environment as close to the source as possible and in as many locations as possible, thus spreading the impact on receiving waters. Fully sustainable drainage can only be effectively implemented on a site if it is incorporated into a developer's plans at the earliest possible stage. Too often, SUDS is seen, or the drainage scheme on a development is seen as a standalone system that is tagged on or doesn't feature in the architect or in the client's consideration of a scheme. Urban drainage is moving away from the conventional thinking of designing for or designing against flooding to balancing the impact of the urban drainage on flood control, on water quality management and on amenity. The use of design best practice can help ensure that SUDS appear as natural as possible and complement existing natural built areas. Where engineered structures are visible, consideration of type, size and material selection can dramatically impact the visual aesthetic of the completed scheme. Syria published a report entitled Planning for SUDS, Making It Happen 4 years ago, or 5 years ago now, which summarises the primary benefits of SUDS. And this concept of the SUDS triangle is reproduced from that guidance document. It shows that flood risk management is just one element of SUDS design, or proper SUDS design, and that water quality management, biodiversity and amenity should also be considerations. Suitability of SUDS techniques. So SUDS techniques fall into 4 main categories depending on where they are used in the SUDS management train. Prevention of runoff and prevention of pollution to runoff can be achieved through land use planning and reduction of paved surfaces. Source control can also be achieved through permeable paving, proprietary systems such as geocellular modular systems, rainwater harvesting and green roofs. Systems such as geocellular modular systems have no amenity value, whereas green roofs can provide habitats and have both amenity and environmental benefits. Site control is dealing with larger parts of our larger scale developments, and can incorporate techniques such as channels and rills, soakaways, bioretention, rain gardens. They can be incorporated within the open space within the sites, and elements such as conveyance to link site control to regional control, or even source control to site control, can include infiltration trenches, filter strips, swales and trench troughs, and they offer significant benefit in terms of filtration of the runoff and sediment control as well. And then regional control would typically comprise detention basins, wetlands and retention ponds, and would be located in open space or in parkland. SUDS components should be located as close as possible to rainwater, to where the rainwater falls, providing attenuation for the runoff. In addition to conventional pipe systems, other methods of conveyance of drainage flow should also be considered in SUDS schemes. As I said, in examples of that include swales and infiltration trenches. In order to achieve water quality improvement, the SUDS management train approach has been advocated, but there's no real guidance or policy on its use in Ireland, so it is often ignored, particularly outside of the Dublin local authorities. Why put in 2 SUDS components into a scheme when you can get away with 1? However, if the full benefits of SUDS are to be achieved, there is a need for a change in approach, and the Water Framework Directive provides for the basis for such a change in thinking and practice. By placing an emphasis on the entire water cycle, small actions at source and at site level can and will contribute to water quality in time. A management train with a minimum of 2 components will contribute to improved runoff quality. The key principle in respect of water quality is that an appropriate management train of SUDS components should be implemented to effectively mitigate the pollution risks associated with different site uses activities. The first flush of surface water. from a paved area generally contains higher concentrations of pollutants as a result of the build-up of solids and pollutants on urban surfaces during the preceding dry weather. To remove the major proportion of pollution, it is necessary to capture and treat runoff from frequent small events and capture and treat a small proportion of runoff from larger events and rarer events. Runoff from impermeable surfaces should be managed at source where possible, and provision of a multi-component treatment train will maximise the treatment efficiency of a wide range of pollutants. On the image I've presented there are two treatment trains or management trains, one going to the right from surface runoff to swales, ultimately next to a basin, and ultimately to a wetland or pond. On the left-hand side, the treatment train comprises permeable paving discharging to a basin or a wetland as well. As I said earlier, the swales can act as both conveyance and also filtration, and so they have a significant role to play in water quality management trains. For discharge to groundwater, the level of hazard posed by a development needs to be considered. Residential development is classed as medium hazard in the UK draft national standards for sustainable drainage systems, which were published in 2011, but which have not been fully implemented as yet. In that case, a minimum of two elements are required for a treatment train discharging to groundwater, with higher sensitivity aquifers requiring a higher level of number of treatment train components. In Ireland, responsibility for surface water management is spread across multiple agencies and authorities, including bodies such as local authorities, roads authorities, the Office of Public Works, Irish Water, and the Department of Environment. We are not unique in this regard. However, the absence of clear guidance and policies can lead to poorly designed drainage schemes and to schemes that do not address all of the objectives in respect of the Water Framework Directive. The Centre for Water Resources Research in UCD published a paper, J.J. O'Sullivan and some colleagues of his published a paper in 2012 in the Water and Environmental Journal, where they presented findings on a survey of SUDS practitioners in Ireland, which they followed up with a focus group interviews. The study revealed that the most commonly used method of attenuating stormwater and restricting outflow was a storage tank with hydraulic control in the form of a hydrobrake. Only a small percentage of those surveyed identified swales, infiltration or porous pavement as being SUDS solutions. The emphasis, it would appear, is primarily on site control rather than source control or conveyance. There's little indication from that survey of familiarity with or the use of swales or bioretention. This is indicative of the exclusive emphasis placed on water quantity reduction in the GDSDS Greater Dublin Strategic Drainage Study guidance and in many of the county development plans. I suppose it's worth noting that the GDSDS Code of Practice for Developers and the GDSDS itself is over 10 years old now. There's probably a need for an updating of some of the policy and guidance that's given in that to bring it up to date. The emphasis was almost exclusively on quantity reduction with very little emphasis placed on quality. River water quality protection is identified in the GDSDS new development policy, and is expressed in terms of interception storage without any reference to filtering, settlement or infiltration. The UCD Centre of Water Resources Research study also established that the principal deterrents to the use of SUDS were considered to be the responsibility for adoption and maintenance, land take concerns, and capital and maintenance costs. They don't need to be issues of concern if SUDS are properly integrated into the overall development. The land is there, the public open space provision is a requirement for most developments, and SUDS properly integrated within a landscaping scheme, within the architectural scheme, can be readily accommodated without eating into the overall land requirements, or the land that's available either for the building or for the associated roads and car parking. A colleague of mine undertook a similar smaller scale piece of research into SUDS last year. Laura Peer of TJ O'Connor's surveyed local authorities on their experience and practices in the use of SUDS as part of a graduate thesis in DIT. She received from engineers and planners in 14 local authorities. The survey respondents indicated that there is no specific departmental responsibility for SUDS in local authorities, that there is a varied approach towards policy and guidance adopted in relation to SUDS, and that there is very little post-construction monitoring of SUDS in respect of compliance with proposals or in respect of water quality improvements achieved. Laura also surveyed or asked the survey respondents regarding their experience in relation to retrofitting of SUDS, and she established that it appears to be very rarely used. Only one local authority among the respondents was promoting a SUDS scheme of its own. SUDS appear to be viewed as associated with new development only or exclusively, and not something to be considered in relation to flood risk management or water quality improvements in terms of network management. Laura also identified an absence of taken in charge policy for SUDS, although a number of the respondents did report that their local authority had taken in charge individual attenuation tanks. In this context, what incentive is there for developers to take on the burden of SUDS if there is no certainty that the SUDS scheme will be taken in charge on completion? This possibly explains why the majority of SUDS schemes that have been implemented in Ireland have been of the attenuation tank detention basin type. There's a greater likelihood of this being taken in charge than a bioretention or a swale solution. It may also explain why schemes tend to comprise a single SUDS element rather than incorporate more elements in a management train approach. The European Framework Directive, which came into force in December 2000, requires Member States to put in place systems for managing their water environment and resources in a sustainable manner, protecting water quality. The Water Framework Directive requires as an objective the achievement of good ecological status for all waters by 2015. It also requires the prevention of deterioration of a water body from one status class to another, typically as a result of urbanisation. This requirement applies to both surface waters and groundwaters. In reality, the requirements of the Water Framework directive cannot be met unless sustainable urban drainage systems are implemented, as they offer an integrated approach that could play a key part in delivering the directive's requirements. The policies guiding the environmental management of urban drainage systems should have regard for EU and national policy criteria. In the UK, in England and Wales, the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 includes a provision for the management of surface runoff and establishes national standards which set out what is to be designed and constructed in order to obtain approval from SUDS approving bodies, and for operating and maintaining SUDS, which the SUDS approval bodies adopts. These standards were published in draft form in 2011, but they have yet to be implemented. And as I said previously, the Secretary of the Department of the Environment, the Environment Secretary, Eric Pickles, has recently thrown the whole issue of SUDS implementation in the UK, or in England and Wales, into doubt by stating that SUDS should only be considered if they're cheaper option than conventional drainage, rather than adopting the approach which has been taken in Scotland, which is where the Water Environment and Water Services Act 2003 makes SUDS mandatory for all new development. In the UK, the limitation is, even under the 2010 Act, is for SUDS to apply only to developments of greater than 10 houses or 10 residential units. The progress in Scotland has been more rapid than in the UK, originally anyway. But sorry. The Scottish Water Services, Water Environment and Water Services Act requires any activity likely to cause pollution to be authorised, and contains provisions for the promotion of sustainable drainage or sustainable development, requiring all designated authorities to have specific regard to sustainable development and flood management in the exercise of their functions. SUDS need to be designed in Scotland in accordance with Scottish Water's specification as set out in their manual, Sewers for Scotland, and in addition the law makes the use of SUDS obligatory when dealing with surface water drainage from all new developments, apart from discharges to coastal waters. A drainage impact assessment is also required in Scotland as part of any new development proposal. The Scottish EPA has also published SUDS for roads, which is a design guide in relation to road developments, both in the urban and in rural settings, and it sets out very clear guidance on the design of filter strips, swales, permeable paving, as well as attenuation and detention basins. It's a very useful document to refer to. Policy in Europe, Netherlands has a similar act, the Dutch Water Act, and in Germany you have the Federal Water Act, also brought in 2009. I suppose Germany is interesting insofar as 10% of all roofs in Germany have been greened, and 10% of paving is permeable. So they're well ahead of the curve in terms of the implementation of SUDS. The emphasis in the German Act is particularly on groundwater protection. In the USA, the Clean Water Act was passed as long ago as 1972, and set out requirements to protect the water environment, both groundwater and surface water, and this is required to be achieved through best management practices. A BMP, best management practice, is a technique, process, activity or structure used to reduce the pollutant content of a stormwater discharge. BMPs include simple non-structural methods such as good housekeeping and preventative maintenance. BMPs may also include structural modifications such as the installation of bioretention measures. BMPs are most effective when used in combination with each other and customised to meet the specific needs of a given operation. BMPs relate to industrial activities as well as urban runoff, so it's a slightly different concept from SUDS in some respects, but the BMPs have developed to include swales, ponds and other constructive features designed specifically for the removal of pollutants. The emphasis under the Clean Water Act is on water quality rather than water quantity. State and local programs in the states are the main drivers, I suppose, in terms of delivery of SUDS type schemes, and the Pacific Northwest in particular, states of Oregon and Washington, which have a climate not dissimilar to that of Ireland, would be at the forefront of the implementation and delivery of SUDS type developments. The City of Portland has a stormwater management manual that is well worth referring to, and in respect of Seattle, the administrative area is the Puget Sound, and their low impact development manual again gives very useful guidance on different SUDS techniques, and I suppose the approach in the States tends to be much more practical than design based. In Ireland, the Water Framework Directive has been implemented through water policy regulations, surface water environmental objective regulations and groundwater environmental objectives regulations. There's I suppose a broad framework of river basin management plans, flood risk management planning, and the planning, the whole planning framework, which feeds into the delivery of SUDS in Ireland. The planning system and flood risk management guidelines, which were implemented into or brought in 2009, makes reference to SUDS. The Greater Dublin Strategic Drainage Study and Code of Practice for Developers also has reference to SUDS, as do many county development plans in differing levels of detail. I suppose the Dunleer Rathdown County Council, their county development plan sets an objective that new developments should incorporate SUDS and should be accompanied by a drainage impact assessment or a SUDS audit, which should be completed in 3 stages, not dissimilar to the road safety audit concept, that you complete an audit pre-planning, completed before commencement of construction, and complete a 3rd stage audit on completion of the scheme. And the audit is carried out independent of the design team. Dunleary Rathdown have a panel of approved auditors. I suppose that particular policy or requirement has been in place since 2010. It hasn't been used extensively by virtue of the fact that there's been little development activity for a few years, for obvious reasons. But with the economy ramping up again, there'll be an increased requirement for that. It's an approach that would perhaps be a template for other local authorities to follow. SUDS components or techniques, the most commonly used are attenuation type ones, the storage ponds, basins, and permeable paving. Some SUDS components are used less frequently in Ireland. Green roofs are an example of that, whether they're the extensive green roof type, sedum type roof, or the intensive green roof type. And the reason being, I would think, is that there were cost concerns in the past. Both Dublin City Council and Dunleary Rathdown have incorporated requirements into their county development plan that larger developments, larger buildings, have to incorporate a green roof element. I think it's 1,000 square metres, which is 10,000 square feet, is the minimum size stated in Dublin City Council development plan. I don't think Dunleary specifies a particular size, but they have a similar requirement. I've noted that in the last 12-18 months, clients are more willing to consider the use of green roofs on schemes, possibly because of BER or BREEAM, BREEAM type approaches to environmental management or environmental auditing on developments, and also perhaps to comply with the local authority policy requirements. Bioretention is another type of SUDS technique, which, if we go back to the original slide that I presented of Smith Square in London and the UK Department of Environment headquarters, it could have significant benefits there. Bioretention and tree pits are variations on the same principle. Runoff discharges into a deep soil depression, often incorporating a gravel underbrush, and the water is then taken up by the plants which grow in the soil. Excess water can pond on the surface of the bioretention area with the provision of an overflow at an appropriate level. My impression is that bioretention is little used in Ireland, possibly because as engineers we're not comfortable with the technique. It's widely used in the US, and where it's used extensively for roadside drainage. The SUDS manual, the Syria SUDS manual, is somewhat vague on the design and detailing of bioretention areas. Some of the US guidance is much clearer. The two documents I referred to earlier, the City of Portland manual and the Puget Sound low impact development manual both give good guidance on bioretention. Tree pits can be incorporated into car parks, into roadside verges, and can take up significant quantities of runoff. And they're, again, significantly underused in Ireland. Swales, and particularly swales for conveyance, are again not widely used in Ireland. I designed swales at Horizon Logistics Park near Dublin Airport over 10 years ago, where they proved very effective at receiving runoff from very large roof areas and warehousing. But their most efficient use is as a conveyance mechanism, providing an alternative to below ground pipework. It's possibly a step too far for some people at present, but they provide the opportunity for filtering and infiltration of runoff. And a swale is essentially just a shallow depression. It can readily accommodate. It can be readily accommodated in roadside verge or within public open space provision in developments. It can be incorporated into the landscaping scheme and can provide an attractive feature within the landscaping. Intrinsically, a swale is going to be cheaper to construct than a pipe system with manholes. It also means that the surface water is at ground level, it's visible, people have a clearer understanding of its function, and as the saying says, out of sight is out of mind, and when something is visible, people will take greater interest in it and greater ownership of it. The slide on the right hand side there is of a scheme in Leicester that I visited not long ago. Some aspects of that particular scheme, the detailing of the outfalls into the swale with brickwork headwalls, show that too often as engineers we look at things purely from a functional point of view rather than trying to see how it can be incorporated into a more aesthetic finish, I suppose. There's no need for a blank headwall in that situation. Rubble placed around the outfall pipe could serve the function just as readily. Retrofitting of SUDS, I suppose, is where the next phase of the development of SUDS as a practice is that's the direction it's heading in. The drivers for retrofitting would include concerns over urban flooding, diffuse pollution impacting on combined sewer overflows, and diffuse pollution in terms of the quality of surface water runoff from urban environments, runoff from roads, from paved areas, discharged via a pipe system directly to watercourses, will impact on the water quality of the receiving water. The challenges facing the management of urban drainage networks include compliance with the European Water Framework Directive, the ageing nature of those networks. Many of the city centre sewers here in Dublin date back to the late Victorian era. New development impacting on the capacity of those networks. Climate change also impacting on the capacity of networks, and the funding to improve or replace those networks, or the lack of funding to address maintenance and improvement issues, means that SUDS retrofitting can be a solution to many of the problems facing combined sewer networks in particular, but also existing surface water drainage networks in the urban situation. So retrofitting can comprise source control, such as green roofs, rainwater harvesting, rainwater pipe disconnection. It can be achieved through, in respect of roads, through rain gardens or bioswales, in verges in conjunction with traffic calming schemes. It can be implemented in terms of flood risk management through utilising existing roads as flood routes in extreme events, and or through using open areas for temporary flood storage. I think there's an example of that in terms of the Wad catchment here in Dublin, which is widely cited in some of the guidance in the UK. There's a need for joined up thinking in relation to SUDS retrofitting. We need to identify catchments that would benefit from such an approach, review schemes or propose schemes for roads, for infrastructure, for housing, and for parks improvements, and identify where possible opportunities for mutual benefit exist. We can also engage with local communities to get them to buy into the idea of SUDS as a benefit to the environment. Incentives can be provided. An example of such incentives is an approach adopted by Thames Water in London, in the Counters Creek area, or in West London, Hammersmith and Fulham in West London, where local residents in particular streets were leafleted, offering them to provide them with rainwater butts, with planters, or with the option of providing permeable paving in their driveways to reduce the amount of runoff entering the combined sewer network in that area, and to eliminate or reduce the frequency of combined sewer overflows. That's been replicated in similar type schemes throughout the UK and also wider afield. Examples of SUDS retrofitting that can be implemented include rainwater pipe disconnection, provision of planters. The example on the right is from Portland in Oregon. Other examples include a retrofitting scheme to address a flood risk in Llanelli in South Wales, where rainwater was diverted off the public roadways and away from combined sewers, and via curbside swales, and in turn into a swale with a stormwater attenuation function in a local park. Another example is a cul-de-sac in Bethnal Green in East London, where cul-de-sac that had been a source of antisocial behaviour was transformed into an attractive urban space through the provision of permeable paving and a rain garden, while at the same time eliminating surface runoff to combined sewers. SUDS can be attractive, they can be beneficial to the environment. They can enhance a development. Examples of schemes that incorporate water or schemes that incorporate a high quality landscape finish. There are such schemes, the residential value is greater than schemes that don't have those features. A property overlooking a pond or a water feature is going to command a higher property value than something that overlooks just a street or a scratchy bit of ground. But in order to achieve that, the SUDS have to be, the drainage scheme has to be incorporated into the planning of the scheme from the outset. It should be up for consideration and integrated into the scheme as part of the overall landscaping, as part of the overall architectural development of the scheme, and not tagged on as something that's completed in the last few days before a planning application goes in. I suppose in conclusion, SUDS have developed over the last 30 years from an original solution addressing attenuation issues or capacity issues in the drainage network to have an increased emphasis on the entire water management cycle, considering both water quality and the amenity and environmental benefits that can be achieved as well. The SUDS, provision of SUDS can be broken down into various steps comprising prevention, source control, site control, regional control. That can be achieved through the implementation of various SUDS techniques that have been developed over the last 30 years, comprising attenuation, infiltration, conveyance techniques including swales and infiltration trenches, and through regional controls such as ponds, detention basins. As I said, SUDS need to be integrated into the overall development proposal. You're going to get a greater buy-in to SUDS if they're located above ground. I think Fingal County Council had the experience 10 years ago or so that a lot of proprietary attenuation systems, below ground attenuation systems, were provided on schemes, and when they went back and looked at them, either the outlet was blocked or they hadn't been maintained, and the capacity that was required to be provided wasn't available for when a storm event occurred. If it's above ground, it's visible. You know if it's not working. I think there's a need for a coherent and updated national policy to SUDS to take the emphasis from just the water quantity or attenuation, which was the centrepiece, I suppose, of the approach in the GDSDS, to reflect the present day thinking, which is the overall management or water management, water cycle management And it's interesting that just in the past week, the devolved government in Wales has published a consultation document on SUDS, possibly in response to the the UK Environment Secretary stalling on the implementation of the England and Wales overall policy. So the Welsh Government has published interim non-statutory standards for the provision of SUDS, providing guidance which encompasses quantity, quality, amenity, environmental standards, and also standards for the operation and maintenance of SUDS. I think the idea of SUDS audits as implemented by Dunleer Ratdown is a template that could and should be followed nationally. Retrofitting of SUDS is something I think that with an increasing requirement for CSO compliance and for water quality compliance, that when schemes are being planned, either traffic calming schemes or road improvement schemes or park schemes within local authorities, that consideration should be given to, well, is there the possibility for piggybacking on such a scheme and addressing something else in terms of the drainage network and issues associated with that as well. And community engagement and education is also something that isn't really pursued in this country. Places like Melbourne in Australia and Kansas in the States have had citywide schemes encouraging people to provide rain gardens in their own private properties to divert the flow from their downpipe into a planted area within their property to create a garden, attractive planted area, but also to reduce the amount of water that's discharged into the sewer network. Both those cities, Melbourne and Kansas, promoted that idea under the slogan 10,000 rain gardens, trying to get as many people as possible to buy into that idea. Places like, or organisations like Thames Water in London have also tried to engage the community in the idea of reducing the amount of water that's discharged to the sewer network. So I hope I've given you some food for thought there in the last 40-50 minutes of my presentation, and I'll draw to a close then. Thank you.
There's a short question and answer session. I've been advised by the staff here that this lecture is being webcast, I suppose, first of all, but in order for the question and answer session to be picked up, it's necessary for people to use the microphone. So if anybody has a question, I'll try and get the mic up to you. Would you pass that to your right, please?
Diarmuid, you gave a very good presentation there, and it's thoughts after my own heart that you put through there, because I've been sort of for years pushing forward SUDS, and part of when I was in the corporation, we put forward the policy document that's in the Dublin City Council, and the other 6 local authorities. And that was under the GDSTS, and they were actually all incorporated into their policies for development policies. The one thing which we couldn't get anybody in central government to take it on as a national policy. Nobody was prepared to take it on. And the big, like a lot of things you were talking about there was the audits that were done. First of all, Dunleary Rathdown, one might ask, why are they so interested in it? It's very simple, is that they have no capacity in any of their streams to take any more runoff. And all their streams actually travel under the railway. And the railway is the controlling factor in the how much water can get from the inland. So the only way you can get any development in Dunleary Rathdown is by introducing fairly extensive SUDS systems. And a lot of the developments there all have them that have been done over the last sort of 10 years. But most of them are in gated communities, which means that the people that run the community, the housing and development, that they actually look after the SUDS facilities, so to keep them working. But the one big thing that I see in this whole SUDS in Ireland anyway is maintenance. There's nobody wants to take on maintenance, and with Irish Water, they have no remit at all with surface water, so they won't go near it. Local authorities are going to lose all their engineers because water and drainage is gone out of their ambit. A lot of the roads, national roads, are out of their ambit, so that the number of qualified people to even go out and assess these won't be there anymore. So while it's great to talk about putting SUDS in to look after, we say, the environment, that unless there's a real flooding implication, I can't see SUDS being implemented. And
if SUDS are implemented as part of the public open space provision in a development, and with local authorities that have a parks department that are already maintaining public open space, the SUDS, if they're above ground, can become part of the public open space maintenance regime. It doesn't require that much additional effort to maintain a swale in a grassed area than it does to cut the grass in that area at regular intervals.
I totally agree with you, but in certain areas, if you take Dublin, there's no large areas left anymore. You need, I'd say, probably about 1,000 or more housing units to justify that large open space. And the Parks Department would look after it. For example, along the Liffey Valley now, Dublin City Council have actually put in a few wetland areas there, which takes the polluted runoff from roads and surface water, puts it through ponds before it goes into the River Talca. And there's a few more proposals there. But the big factor against these, which we were trying to get a lot of retrofitted in Dublin, and there's large areas that can be done, is lack of money. And the government won't give any money, and the local authorities don't have a lot of money. And there's a few schemes before I retired were on the cards there, and they're still sitting there, and they would be of great benefit to the communities, but I couldn't find money anywhere to implement them, which is a great pity. But I think what you've outlined here, things that are dear to my heart. Thank you.
How you doing? Thank you very much for that talk. It was really good. I actually come not from an engineering side, but from I'm an environmental scientist, and I work with inland fisheries. And I just wanted to comment on the drivers necessary for this that you've touched on already, which is really the Water Framework Directive and the importance of it. I mean, if you have large urban areas, as we have all over the place, and we haven't been looking at SUDS until relatively recent times, essentially you're doing for the groundwater, what happens to rivers, where some rivers are actually just dredged channels, just used for conveyance of water, you're actually depriving the groundwater. And from a surface water perspective, at low flow intervals, this is really very important, that we actually can get recharge back into our groundwaters, because in low flows, our surface waters, 90% of the water coming into the streams is from groundwater sources. So at low flow times, it's really very important. So from our point of view, it's really important that SUDS is actually bought into, and we see it quite a lot in road developments now. And it's much more beneficial all round, because you're actually getting clean water by the time that discharges into a river or stream. So from our point of view, SUDS has to be an integral part of what we're actually moving into the future, if we're actually going to preserve both our groundwater and our surface waters as well.
But in some of the European countries, the likes of Germany and Holland, they prioritise where you dispose of or discharge surface water runoff, and they say the first point of call should be to discharge to ground, and subsequently to discharge to surface or water course, and then third level discharge to a surface water sewer. So if you can discharge to ground and as close as possible to source, so through permeable paving or infiltration to ground, as close as possible to source, then that's the way to go, provided you're ensuring that you're achieving some filtration of that water as before it gets to ground, and I suppose also that you're cognizant of what the vulnerability of that groundwater body is, and that by discharging directly to ground, you're not impacting negatively on that groundwater as well. That you're filtering out any pollutants that may be present in the runoff, and doing it in a proper manner before it goes to ground.
Yeah, that is actually what's happening in quite a lot of the roads, things at the moment, where you have swales in particular, and you also have the discharges going to the subcatchments, so that you're spreading the load, you're not actually overloading any particular rivers or streams. But just in the context of the vulnerability of groundwaters, is there any information available as to the depth of overburden above potable supply that would be required for road runoff in particular? Attenuating and removing the pollutants.
I've seen reference to depths of, say, 2 meters as being an ideal minimum. The Scottish EPA's SUDS for roads guidance document, I think, refers to a 2 meter depth as being to water table as being the ideal to achieve or to maintain.
Okay, thanks very much.
Anybody else?
Thanks. Paul Doyle, Dublin City Council. I'd like to thank you for an excellent talk, and you hit on quite a number of areas I'd very strongly agree with, and I think it's something we probably need to resurrect. It's a subject that's gone off the boil a little bit, I think, lately. I worked on the GDSTS. I did a lot of the SUD stuff. I spent weeks in my life researching material on biodiversity and swales and detention basins and the like, and the environmental benefits of those to go into the policy. So I was a little bit surprised to hear none of that was there, although I will accept that the main emphasis would appear to be on the quantity rather than quality. That's largely because the quantity is what people measure, and therefore it's very easy to set the policy based on a quantity. Also, we had a lot of difficulty with the whole SUDS policy when we started to bring it out first, insofar as people had always thought of rainwater as clean, and when we suddenly started talking about removing pollutants, suddenly you started to raise concerns that people were going to get polluted material in their swales, and would children be running across it playing football, would you be getting in detention basins, would you be getting all sorts of pollutant material in them. And also, on the last subject, I remember being almost savaged at a conference down in Tullamore once by people who were certain we were trying to put polluted water into groundwater, ignoring the fact we were actually cleaning up that water greatly before it got into the groundwater, rather than putting the fully polluted water directly into watercourses. Another issue that I think needs to be considered, and again, it's just part of it, it's just how we as a nation look at it, but from a consulting engineer's viewpoint, you'll find that if you look at your SUDS as purely an end of pipe, one large storage tank, that's now a solution that a graduate engineer can knock out in about half an hour. If you start actually looking at trying to do this properly with all the different detention basins and you know, the whole SUDS train, that becomes a lot more difficult and a lot more costly, and perhaps there's a view that clients aren't particularly willing to pay for that. Overall, there have been some improvements lately. I know you mentioned already we've got a couple of pretty big schemes in Dublin, mostly on the WAD. I've seen lately there's smaller things going on. There are people putting down pipes in public roads into planters. Not an ideal solution, but it's a start. And again, most of the local authorities are selling water butts at cheaper rates. So there's an attempt to encourage it, but I would accept we've an awful long way to go. And I think part of the problem is that you tend to get, you know, a handful of people in organisations with an almost apostolic zeal for spreading the message of SUDS, but for most people it's not mainstream yet, and until it becomes mainstream thinking, I think we're not going to get the bigger solutions that I think we need. Overall, though, I thought that was an excellent talk tonight and very timely. Thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, if not, then we'll bring things to a close. I suppose it falls to me to thank Diarmuid on behalf of the institution for taking the trouble to present this evening's paper. I know that he put in a lot of thought and time into his presentation, and it certainly showed. I've certainly taken away from this evening's talk that SUDS has enormous untapped potential to deal with both water quality and flooding related issues, whatever about amenity value. I think it's quite astonishing that a politician like Eric Pickles can, at the stroke of a pen, unpick a lot of very carefully crafted guidance, and it shows a degree of short-sightedness which is quite astonishing. I've yet to read of any response from our institution, but I can't imagine that it's anything other than a rebuke when it eventually comes. I think that we shouldn't fall into the same trap in this country if we can avoid it. So with that, that's an end to proceedings this evening, so if you can all show your appreciation.